We are in class number 6 again. This is class 6 continued. We got about half of the material done last week that I intended to cover. I knew it was more material than I could cover in a class, but it is the same subject. So we'll be continuing in 1 Timothy 3 and then Titus 1 and 2, exploring the Greek and the instructions that are given in those 3 chapters. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the hope that it gives us. We thank you for the wisdom. We ask you to bless us with your Holy Spirit this evening to help us to be able to understand these principles we're struggling with. Be with us, help us to be open, help us to be humble. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, we will continue with the same kind of format we've been doing. I'm going to recap what we covered last week fairly quickly, and I'll pause at that point and allow anybody that wants to make some observations about 1 Timothy 3 that we covered last week. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time looking at Titus 1 and 2. And then we're going to try to answer the question about one woman man, or the husband of one wife verse or phrase that's used a couple of times. So let's look at or recap our words again. These words are interesting and somewhat confusing. Greek is not English. Okay, so English is English and Greek is Greek, and never the two shall meet, or whatever, I don't know. But doing translations is a difficult thing, and we should be very thankful for the people who have given their lives to learn another language so that they can give us a shot at understanding it. If we all had to learn Greek, we'd be probably in a lot of trouble, or Latin, or whatever you still have to learn. Anyway, a couple of Greek words we're going to work through here right quickly, and then we'll kind of catch up in Titus. We looked at the word aner, which is a male human being, and it's translated as usually man or husband, used a bunch of times in the New Testament, 433 times. And so it's a fairly common word, and it leans more towards you're talking about a male. The other word is anthropos, which is often translated man, particularly in the older translations. It has more of the flavor of person or humanity or mankind is the word we used to use. It's usually used when the gender is not important. It's not really talking about the gender of something. It's just talking about people. Most of the newer translations translate it as humanity or peoples or that kind of thing. A couple of examples we looked at last week. The salt's going to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Well, it's not men that are only, it's not males that are trampling the foot necessarily, it's people. But 1 Timothy 2, make prayers on behalf of all men. Well, it's not, you're not supposed to only pray for males, you're supposed to pray for people. But 1 Timothy 2:8, we see that it's used, aner is used when it probably is leaning towards the idea that men who should lift up their holy hands without anger or quarreling. So those 2 words. Now, the other word that's kind of in contrast with aner is the word gune, which is a woman or wife. Now, I think we made some good observations last week that at this time in history, 1st century, especially in Jewish culture, but probably also some in the Roman Greek culture, there's not a category for bachelor. There's not a Greek word for bachelor. There's not a Greek word for bachelorette. So if we had the TV show back in the 1st century, it would be Gune and Gune or whatever. And so there wasn't a lot of people that were unmarried, unassociated, single. And so the word for gune is sometimes translated woman and sometimes translated wife. An heir is sometimes a male man or sometimes husband. And we looked at some of these verses last week. I won't run through them all again, but just note that most of the time it's fairly clear when the word husband or wife is needed in the context. It usually has some kind of possessiveness, but because of immoralities, each is to have his own wife. Well, have his own woman is what it says. Well, his own woman would be wife, or her own husband, her own aner would be husband. And so you can see from the context, usually it has some sort of possessiveness to it. He had her, had been married 7 times, had her as a wife. The Samaritan woman, on the other hand, chapter 4 of John, is just a woman, and she's not married. And so it's translated as woman. But the point being is that you go through this, and this is somewhat important when we get in 1 Timothy 3, this idea that the writers of the New Testament understood there wasn't a word for bachelorette. And so they would have made it fairly clear by putting in some possessiveness or some context that made it clear. So that plugs in when we get to the verse 11 in 1 Timothy 3 that we looked at briefly last week. All right, some of the other words that we're going to focus on more in Titus is the word presbyteros, the presbyter. In 9th King James, it's usually translated bishop, the presbyteros. And this slide's a little different than last week. I did some more work on this slide. It's used 79 times in the New Testament. The vast majority of the times in the New Testament, it is the Jewish elders, the chief priests and the elders, or the tradition of the elders, or Jesus got crosswise with the Pharisees, the scribes, and the elders. I didn't count it, but probably 50 of the, maybe more, maybe 50 to 60 times. When you see this, you see that that's who they're talking about, this group of people who were the Jewish elders. And so of the less than 20 times that are less, that's translated other ways. We can see some of those examples here. Luke chapter 1, Zacharias said to the angel, "How will I know this is certain? For I am an old man." Presbytes, it's a little bit different word, but he is an old man, and my gune is advanced in years. So my wife, the president, it's wife because of the possessiveness there. And so Zacharias is not saying that he's an elder at the church. He's not one of the Jewish scribes and elders. He's saying he's old. And so he would use the same word. Also, I looked looking up today, Luke 15:25, the story of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and then the lost son. Well, it's the older son, the presbyteros huios. So it's when referring to the eldest son, you see the same word, elder son, was in the field and came in when the younger son was there. So it's used for the word older. Also in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, we find the Spirit pours forth in my spirit on all mankind, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see vision, and your old men shall dream dreams. That's the same word there. Presbyteros is your old men. It's not talking about the elders of the church are going to dream dreams, but rather the old men's going to dream dreams. And another interesting usage of presbyteros is in Hebrews 11:2. The New Revised Standard Version says, "For by it the men of old gain approval." Young's literal translation says, "For in this were the elders testified of." The NIV and most of your modern translations use the word ancient here, or you're talking about somebody from old times. But it's really the same word here, presbyteros, for by it the old men gained approval. Well, it's not old, and not talking about their age being old, but talking about from previous in history. So the word is used kind of in a variety of ways. Like I say, most of the time it's used of the Jewish ruling elders, but it is used in several other ways, as you can see from these examples. The other couple of examples, it's a little bit more difficult to see or to translate the word presbyteros. The 1 Timothy 5, Do not sharply rebuke. And some of the translations go with elder and has the sense of an official position of the church. And others go with the word older man. So do not sharply rebuke an older man, presbyteros, but rather appeal to him as a father. Most of them go with elder man because the younger men are brothers, the older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters. But the word older man, and the word older women are both the same basic word, presbyteros. And 1 Timothy 5 was one of the verses we studied when we were looking at what elders do. The 1 Timothy 5, 17 through 20 seems to have this same idea of the ones who are ruling well, these people who are been selected, ordained to be elders. So anyway, and I guess 1 Peter 5:5, the context before that is talking about those who are elders of a church. But then you have this the younger men likewise be subject to your elders in the sense of the church or older people. So anyway, sometimes it is a little difficult for the translators to choose which way the word is going to lean. And as I think we said this last week, perhaps one of the thoughts is there's really not much difference, that those who were older were the elders, and there may not have been a lot of distinction between the older set and those who were ruling the congregation. They may have been one in the same group. But anyway, that's one of the words we're going to look at when we get to Titus here in just a moment, that the translators kind of have to lean one way or the other. Either they lean towards, well, this just means an older person, or they lean towards this means a person who is an official of the congregation. So sometimes it's hard to tell in the context, but most of the time it's fairly obvious how the word is translated. Also, we looked at this last week. The atis is if anyone. It's used, this little phrase is used quite a few times in the New Testament. If anyone does not provide for his own, if anyone advocates a different doctrine, if anyone is in Christ, if anyone is a hearer of the word, if anyone comes to you, the phrase does not lend itself to male nor female. It's just if anyone comes, it doesn't lean in a gender at all. All right, let me pause there and ask if there are any questions about those words before we get to recap our 1 Timothy 3. Any question on those words or comments? Not necessarily questions. All right, let's. We studied this last week, but I wanted to refresh our minds a little bit. Just kind of quickly go through it. If you have the handouts, if you came in late. Jordan or Daniel, everybody got a handout, same handout as last week. Anyway, just quickly let me recap the points that we made last week, and then we'll get on into tonight's finishing up the lesson in Titus chapter 1 and 2. 1 Timothy 3, from the Greek interlinear here, trustworthy is the sayings, if anyone. I think Paul could have chosen the word an heir if he wanted to here, if any man. Some of the translations translated if any man, but it doesn't say any man. It says if anyone, an overseer aspires to, of good a work he is desirous. It behooves therefore the overseer above reproach to be. And then we see the mias is one, gune is wife, aner is husband, sober, self-controlled, and it goes through all this different lists that we find that we've gone through. And if you keep in the chart in your other hand over here, you can see all these lists of the different qualities of an overseer. And then in verse 8, it says diakonos, which we studied before, is the word for deacon. Likewise, now the likewise is in here kind of indicate there's a kind of a change in thought, but not a change in thought. There's just likewise, like all the stuff we set up here, likewise deacons must be, and he goes through a list not as long as the first list, but dignified, not double-tongued, not given to wine much, not greedy. And he goes through, and you can see that second column on the Excel handout lists the qualifications, the qualities of deacons. There's a couple of overlap, not much really. The not given to wine is on both lists. Not greedy is on both lists. And then the rest of them seem to be not repeated. Now, the question then that we struggled with last week, and I'll just recap it here in verse 11, is then it just says women. Likewise. And so we have this likewise thought. Well, here's another group of people that likewise the deacons, or maybe likewise the overseers, and it lists their qualifications: dignified, not slanderous, clear-minded, faithful in all things. Not a very long list, just 4 things mentioned here. But the question is, who is he talking about here in this context? I guess you could say the context is church leadership in a general sense, where you have overseers, likewise deacons, likewise women. And then it goes back in verse 12 and says, deacons then let be of one wife husbands, and goes on to talk several other qualifications, which are in this third column on your Excel sheet. So we kind of would be nice, I think maybe I'm behind the slide here. It'd kind of be nice if Paul had been a little clearer with verse 11. He does not add there, which would have made it fairly clearly that he was talking about wives. He does not use the word women deacons. He doesn't use that. He doesn't say women overseers. He doesn't say, all he says is the word women. And so we're having to try and kind of figure out who these women are. I don't think anybody can be hard over on it, because it's just not 100% clear as to who they are. There's some of the observations. I think I noted most of these already. It is a translator's choice to determine if the word there is woman or the word is to be wife. So let me pause there. I think I mentioned all of these observations. So, and number 3, you have the flow of the instructions here. There's the overseers in general. There's deacons in general. Then there's these women, whether they're women deacons, wives, women elders, both, neither, none of the above, all the above, whatever they are. And then you have back to what seems to be men deacons in the fourth category, because you do have this list of back to one woman man is the first thing mentioned after that. I did have the thought of another possibility, that perhaps because he doesn't have any adjectives with the women here, he doesn't say there, which would indicate towards wives. He doesn't use presbyteros, women, and he doesn't use deacon. All he says is women. That maybe the thought he is portraying here is that women in general in leadership positions. Maybe what he's saying is it's any woman in any kind of servant, diakonos, overseer position should be dignified, not slanderous, clear-minded, faithful in all things. So perhaps because there is no adjectives at all here, and there is no there here, that maybe he's saying that women in any kind of church role, I'm not sure how you want to say that, should be this way. So he doesn't specifically hone in on any of them, but perhaps would include any women in any kind of a servant role must be dignified, not double-tongued, clear-minded, and faithful. If I had to put some money down, I wouldn't. I mean, you could put some, one of these things, where's Beverly? Beverly always, when we get to heaven, we're going to ask him. Well, I wouldn't put any money down wagering anything on this. I lean a little bit maybe towards my idea that we had with this is just women in general who are in some kind of position of being a servant in the church. Jordan's observation last week, I think, was really pretty significant. Well, the chapter before this tells him to be silent, not to be bossy over anybody, and so it'd be a little odd for him to, in chapter before this, tell him to not have any authentane, and yet then turn right around and have some qualities for them as being elders. So that would kind of make you lean a little bit away from this being women elders, but perhaps it is any woman in a position of servantness. That would be probably my best shot. All right, so let's stop. I think Robert has a thought, and then anybody else wants to share here, then we'll move on to Titus.
So the question that just came to my mind was, if you look at the back and forth, as you go through that sequence, you have the elder or overseer shall be a one-wife man, and then you talk about women, and then you have deacon one-wife man again. The only other time you talk about a gune up until that point in this section is as the wife of an elder. So why you don't necessarily juxtapose those two sets of verses, 8 through 10 and 3:11, I don't necessarily know. But you then go to say, you have a one woman man deacon. To me, it does lean to say this is the wife that we just talked about as a elder's wife. But that, I think to me, that is a delineation feature. That's what makes sense to me. I'm not, not married to it.
I see your argument. It does mention in the first block the one wife husband, and then in the last block the one wife husband. You could be right. I certainly can't say that you're wrong. It seems a bit awkward, kind of any way you do this, but it would have been, been fairly easy, and Paul does it all the other times he talks about wives. He has a there in there. Just a there would have cleared it up. He doesn't put the there, so that kind of makes me lean the other way. And we're going to talk about the one wife husband phrase in a minute. Anyway, other thoughts? Like I say, we worked through this last week, but I wanted to kind of freshen up our thoughts on that before we go to Titus. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and look at Titus. The New American Standard Version is on the screen, but I'll be reading from the interlinear that on the handout. So of this, on account I left you in Crete, so that the things lacking you might set in order, and might appoint in every town presbyteros, elders, as I have directed, or as I have you directed. So a couple of observations right off. First Timothy is written to Ephesus. Ephesus has had a church almost from the beginning of the church history part. At least 10 years there's been a church in Ephesus going on, and so they would have developed a lot of elders and deacons and roles and whatnot. This appears to be a little different scenario in Crete. Paul and Titus had just gone to Crete, did their little mission trip, And then Paul has to go away, and he leaves Titus there in Crete to appoint elders in brand new churches. And so these would have been less than year-old churches, as opposed to Ephesus, which would have had probably 10 years history. Now, none of those are old churches, but I mean, 10 years is not very old either. But certainly 10 years is way older than one. I mean, these are brand new churches. They start them and went back around, and he left them there to appoint elders. And so it's a little different wording than Timothy. Timothy, Paul doesn't give Timothy any instructions about choosing elders in 1 Timothy 3. The thought begins, if anyone wants to be an elder, then they have these qualifications. Well, in Crete, Titus has gone around and he's going to appoint these presbyteros. And also note that Timothy, it uses the word overseer, not elder. But here in 1 Timothy 1, Paul tells Titus to appoint elders as I give you all the instructions already. So it'd be nice for us to have had all those instructions that he gave Titus, but he's as I've directed you. And then he gives some of the same qualifications that are in the Timothy list. Once again, it starts out with the atis, if anyone, which is gender neutral. If anyone is blameless, and we have the same phrase here, one woman husband, children having believing, not under accusation of debauchery or insubordinate, it behooves for the overseer. Now he uses the word overseer here, which was kind of one of the reasons why we link overseer with elder. So the overseer, blameless to be as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not a striker, not greedy of base gain, but hospitable. There's our philo word, hospitable to strangers, a lover of good, self-controlled, diakon, which is righteousness, upright, holy, and disciplined, holding to, according to the teaching, faithful of the word, that able he may be both to encourage with teaching, sound teaching, and those contradicting it to convict. And so he begins again. Titus is going to go around, and Titus is appointing these people, and he's looking to anyone who has these different qualities, qualifications, whatever, down through 5 through 9. And so if you look in back on the Excel spreadsheet, that fifth column, the ones that are in black are the ones that are found here in verses 5 through 9, above reproach, one woman man. And then the self-controlled is on both lists, which is interesting. Self-controlled is on 1:8, and also we'll see it again in 2:2. And it goes through the rest of these qualifications of this person that Titus is going to appoint as an elder. Then I wasn't planning on doing this last week. We have a little more time just tonight. Let's go ahead and read. Doesn't have it on your handout. Let's go ahead and read the verses in between this first section where he gives these qualities, and then the second section, which we're going to struggle with. So he ends verse 9 by saying, this person is sound in teaching so that he can convict those who are contradicting the sound teaching. And then in Titus 1:10, for there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, deceivers, especially of those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things that should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. That's not what you want to be known for. Well, everybody knows that Cretans are liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. For this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their mind and their conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. But as for you, and I think Paul speaking directly to Titus, but as for you, speak to things which are fitting for sound doctrine. And so what we're going to try to do is kind of pick up the flow of these verses. So from Titus 1:5-9, Titus is supposed to select anyone who has these qualifications. And then he has a little insert here between verses 10 through 2:1 about why it's important that you're going to select these people. You're going to select these people because they're sound in the truth, because they know how to teach, because they know how to contradict those who are teaching wrong, because Christians are always liars, evil beasts, and gluttons, and because there's these Jewish myths and commandments that are messing things up. And so he gives this one paragraph explaining why it's important for Titus to be able to choose wisely these people who are going to be elders. Now, the question comes tonight, and once again, we're not going to come away with any convincing arguments or anything, but I wanted to show you that when you get back to Titus 2, verse 2, it's the same word that he used in Titus 1, Titus chapter 1, verse whatever it is, 5. And so the word is presbyteros in verse 2. We're in Titus 2:2. Presbyteros, sober-minded, are to be dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and endurance. Now, if you and I'm sure everybody knows this, but let me just say it, that there's no chapter breaks in the original Greek language. In fact, there's no verses, there's no paragraphs, there's no periods. And so the person who chose to put the chapter break here did, but there should have been a chapter break, or maybe there should be a chapter break. Well, the chapter break should be verse 2, not verse 1, either way. But anyway, in verse 2, I just want to note that the aged men here, or older men, is translated by the New American Standard Version, and I think maybe all the versions. The word older men there is still the same word of elder in the previous chapter. And so the question is, why do the translators translate the word older men in verse 2 when in the previous chapter it's elders? Why would they choose to change to the word older men and not this idea of the people to whom Titus is supposed to be selecting as elders? Well, there's reason. As we keep reading, the aged men or elders are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in the faith, in love, endurance. And then verse 3, it's the aged women. The same Greek word, presbyteros, only has a feminine ending. So you have the aged women, and then we have the word likewise again, in behavior, reverent, not slanderous, not to whine much, being enslaved, teachers of what is good, so that they may train and we do have a word here for younger women, to be lovers of husbands, to be loving their children, self-controlled, pure, keepers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that not the word of God should be maligned. And then verse 6, the younger men likewise exhort to be self-controlled. And just finishing the thought, let's go ahead and finish the thought here with the next few verses here in Titus 2:7-10. In all things, show yourself to be an example of good deeds. So Paul talking directly to Titus again. With purity and doctrine, dignified, sound in speech, which is beyond reproach, so that the opponent would be put to shame, having nothing bad to say about us. Urge bond slaves or slaves to be subject to their own masters in everything, to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, but showing all good faith so that they will adorn the doctrine of God, our Savior, in every respect. And at the rest of the chapter, he kind of goes on to a different thought. So the question becomes, what do we do with presbyteros in verse 2? And what do we do with the feminine version of presbyteros in verse 3? So, as I said, most of the translators go with older men and then older women because the younger women are mentioned, and then younger men, and then some instructions to Titus, who I assume was a younger man, and then to slaves. So the thought is that the translators think there is a break somewhere in verse 1 or 2, that Titus 1, chapter 5, verse 5 through 9 is talking about those whom Titus is supposed to appoint as elders. And then Paul changes gear in verse 2 and is talking about older men, older women, younger men, younger women, and slaves and whatnot. So, but you have to understand in the Greek, the words are the same. The words for elders in verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5, is the same root word as Titus 2 and Titus 2:2 and Titus 2:3. So we're left with kind of a choice. We could continue the thought that, okay, well, Paul kind of interrupted himself when he was talking about it's important for Titus not to be sound in the faith because of what's happening in Crete and because of false teaching and because of Jewish and whatnot. And he comes back to his thought in verse 2 with some more instructions about the elders. And then in verse 3, some instructions about women elders. Or the thought is that he's changed gears and now he's just talking about the congregation as a whole, beginning with old guys, old women, young men, slaves. So that's kind of the thought. The choice that the translators have at this point is either to assume that the thought has changed in chapter 2, and the thought changed to be now we're talking about older men and older women. The thought has changed from who Titus is supposed to have appointed in chapter 1. Let me go ahead and put observations here. I think I've covered most of these. If anyone is still the same thought, he does use the word elder and overseer. Interestingly, there's no deacon instructions. And writing to Ephesus, you got more deacon instructions than elder instructions or overseer instructions, but there's no deacon instructions here. The word diakonos is not used. I think the rest of these I've already mentioned. So anyway, you can look on your handout, and you can, on the Excel handout, and you see the last column there, which is aged women, same word elder, is some of the same qualities we've run across before. They're supposed to be able to teach. They're not given to wine. They're to be reverent, not slanderers, which are some of the same instructions before. I don't know if that helps us at all, but anyway, the thought is if you stayed strictly with the Greek words here and translate them as you did in chapter 1, it comes out fairly different than if you put the chapter 2 heading in and then go with aged men and aged women. All right, observations. Gary has a thought. Dwayne?
Some would say that these lists in Titus 2 are qualifications for men elders and qualifications for women elders. But what about the slaves? Are these qualifications for slaves? No, that doesn't work. So these must be instructions on how to behave.
The instructions do fit better than qualifications. I mean, they're instructions on He's given Titus instructions. He's giving, all these are kind of instructions: be hospitable to strangers, not be given too much wine, not greedy, that kind of thing. So probably instructions is a better word than qualifications all the way through here. Okay. Julia has a thought.
I think it asked the women to teach what is good, which struck me as it just told them to teach what is good. And I think we had another verse that said, don't let the women teach over men. So is this where do we turn this into women can only teach women? I have other things, but that's number one.
This is not, it is a little bit worded a little bit differently. If you'd had just lists of instructions, you would have aged men instructions, aged women instructions, and then young women instructions, but it's not exactly that way. The instructions given to the aged women are so that they can teach the younger women to be lovers of husbands and whatnot, their list of things here. So there's at least the assumption that these aged women are teaching the younger women. Let me follow what you're saying here. Older women likewise to be reverent in behavior, not malicious, gossips, not enslaved to much, teaching what is good. And I think if we were writing this in English, you'd put a semicolon there or something, teaching what is good. Here's the things that are good: to encourage young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, to be pure workers at home, kind, subject to their husbands, not so the word of God will not be dishonored. And likewise, I don't know, do you break the paragraph at likewise, or are the older women supposed to be teaching the younger men too? There's no, if the sentence doesn't break, if the paragraph doesn't break there, these are the same thought. The older women are teaching not only the younger women, but they're also teaching the younger women to be sensible. And then he goes back to Titus, in all things show yourself to be an example of the good things that you're teaching. And then he has in verse 9, urge the bondservants. And those are fairly clearly, like Gary said, fairly clearly instructions. You don't have to have a qualification to be a bondservant, I don't guess. Anybody can be a bondservant. Why don't you just leave the mic with her there?
So it's, are men not supposed to teach women what is good? Is it just women?
I don't
who are
think that it
supposed
works both backwards. It doesn't say anything about, well, I guess maybe if you go back to the Titus 1:9.
It says men should teach the young men to be self-controlled. So do we not have that responsibility as women?
I guess I'm not following the thought
He
there.
says, I think later he says, teach the young men to be self-controlled.
Right, verse 6, Titus 2:6. Likewise, urge young women to be sensible according to the numeric standard.
So I guess what my point I'm trying to say is, it seems to me like the women should be teaching people, and maybe they have a focus, but then also the men should be teaching people, but they're both teaching people.
Right. Well, that you get that from Titus 1:5. Titus 1:9, holding to the truth according to the teaching, faithful to the word, able to be both to encourage and to teach. So back in verse 9 of chapter 1, that group of elders are supposed to be teaching, and then he has an entire paragraph about why teaching is so important.
So isn't kind of the definition of an elder an older person who teaches?
That'd be a
So-
pretty simple definition.
So I guess it seems like these are women elders to me because they're teaching.
That would be one point of contact. You have on the list in 1 Timothy, they're able to teach. In Titus, they're able to teach, and these women are also supposed to be able to teach. An old person that's teaching. Now, the question becomes, is that the ones that Titus were supposed to appoint, or is that just a generic teaching that we're all supposed to do? Jordan?
Looking at, you had mentioned about the word, various words for men. So I was looking at what the meaning of the word that is translated younger men, and it's very similar to the younger women, and it's basically new.
It's the
Is
word
that
new.
is that actually meant to be adults, or is that meant to be children? Because if you
new
also
women.
then look, if andros is also of all men, not just husbands, then it could be read, teach the young women to love other people and to love children, and teach young men to be self-controlled. Or teach girls to love people, teach boys to be self-controlled.
Yeah, and once again, there's a little bit of a difference in our culture and theirs. There wasn't a teenage category. You went from being a child to being an adult when you got bar mitzvah or whatever. So yeah, that would be.
When would they have stopped calling them new? Since that's what those are both. It's not young, it's new.
It is new men and new women. But there is a word for children. You see the word children there. So he's not talking about children when he says new men and new women. I think that's, maybe that'd be worth me pursuing a little bit. Where is that used? Where is those particular words used in other places? And is it understood that that's just a euphemism for young men, young women? But I appreciate what you're doing there. You're seeing that the translators, as they come down through here, are making choices about, well, these young women are to love their husband. Well, the young women could be loving men in general and their children, but it's their men. Their men pushes it back towards husband, and their children. I hadn't looked that up in the Greek, but I'd assume, well, I'd have to look and see if that was actually the possessive there. Anyway. Other thoughts? We've got a little bit of time. All right,
I got one. Sorry.
Robert.
Going back to Titus 1, there is a direct tie between the presbyteros used there.
I'm sorry, Rob, you have to speak up. I can't hear you. I know
Sorry.
you're talking to yourself loud in your head.
The presbyteros in Titus 1 has a direct link to overseer. And though, in fact, there are sort of qualifications for elder and qualifications for overseer, and we merge those together. But and then we try to determine if anything that we carry forward in Titus 2 would still apply to overseer. And that's where I'm starting to wonder, is there actually a break between elder in Titus 1 and overseer in Titus 1?
That is a really interesting question. Maybe only to me, but it's interesting because, back in Timothy, it's only overseer. If Paul has a little different thought in mind, where he was thinking that overseer in 1 Timothy is really just anyone in a position of helping others, servant leadership, whatever you want to say. And so it's a broader category in First Timothy 3. And then he talks about appointing elders for a few verses. And then it comes down then to verse 7. It behooves for the overseer. And then there seemed to be another set of instructions, qualifications, whatnot. And so if that were two different groups, that would certainly shift the change there. But I don't know that anybody's thought that thought before, Robert. But it does strike me as a little bit odd that in Timothy, he's writing to this older church and he's talking about deacons and who we would call elders. He's talking to a bigger group of people. But in Titus, he's really only talking about these elders that he's supposed to appoint. And we kind of assume that they're the same group, but if you tried to parse those out a little bit, you would end up with another column on your Excel spreadsheet. It would be a different set. I don't know whether that gets us anything, but it could be that he using those two different words more specifically than just generically. That is a good thought. I appreciate you saying that. I had thought that a little bit before, but I guess maybe I hadn't made the connection there too much in Titus. All right, let's do one more thought and then we'll quit. This phrase that we've run across a couple times already, the husband of one wife in 1 Timothy 3:2 and in Titus 1:6, as you've seen from the handout, it's just 3 words. It's one, woman, man. And then it's translated several different ways. You can see the New Jerusalem Bible is translated, a congregational leader must be above reproach. He must be faithful to his wife. That's the the Jewish New Testament, I guess, J&T. And then the NLT says, for an elder must be a man whose life cannot be spoken against. He must be faithful to his wife. And in the New Revised Standard Version, now a bishop must be above reproach, married only once. Well, that's a different thought altogether. Married only once would be something speaking against polygamy, I guess, or divorce maybe. But if you translate it as faithful to his wife, that kind of has a different, to me, a different flavor altogether. And so we also seen the same phrase talking about deacons there in 1 Timothy 3:12. We understand that there are female deacons, but in this one set of instructions in the 4th column there is this one woman man again. And then a similar phrase, just to completely confuse the situation, is used in 1 Timothy 5:9 of a widow who's no longer married. And in order to enroll her into support from the congregation, she's got to be at least 60 years of age and a one-man woman. Well, she's not even married at the time. She's a widow. And so I think the thought here is that this is, it must be an idiom that's talking about being faithful. So I don't think it's a qualification in terms of you having to have a wife or having to be a husband, but rather taking it as an idiom to be faithful. And we even use the term faithful. Jordan and I talking about this last week. The word faithful is an idiom. If I say, I am faithful to Tanya, you would understand me to mean that I haven't had sex with anybody else but Tanya. But that's not what the word meant. If I'm faithful to Tanya, I could just believe that she exists. I could believe that she is going to reward me. I could believe, like we talk about being faithful to God, I could be a good person to her. Even the word faithful in English, we understand it to be an idiom, to be sexually committed. So I think this one, my opinion, this one woman man is an idiom that means faithful, which is important. Obviously, you don't want somebody in a leadership position who is got a bunch of wives or unfaithful to his wife or whatever bad thing you want. Gary? I got Farley.
I'm going to say this in that if it meant faithful to your wife, the word pistos would have been used, which means faithful, just like it was used in verse 11 about women faithful in all things. That word is not here. So putting in faithful is interpreting the one woman man.
Well, it's using our idiom for their idiom, I think. So obviously, faithful in their language wouldn't have meant faithful. It'd have been how we had faith in somebody.
Monogamous?
Huh?
Monogamous?
Monogamous, monogamous would be the word. Monogamous kind of leans more towards, as opposed to polygamous, right? And it could be, I have heard that in Crete, the polygamy was still being practiced. And so it could mean that. I don't think it means that because it wouldn't make any sense. You're not going to put the widow on the list that she'd been a polygamist. Well, she would have been a polygamist. She'd have been multiple wives married to one husband. So anyway, like I say, this is not, once again, it's not one of these things that are, it's hard to see. It's not used. I think these are the only 3 times it's used in the New Testament. But the translators sometimes use our idiom faithful for their, even though the word pistos is not used for theirs. Anyway, I thought that would be worth me bringing up. All right, we got a couple minutes. The conclusions, well, there's not any. Who are the women in 1 Timothy 3:11? It just says women. And who are the older women? Presbyteros and Titus 2:3 are the 2 questions that we have struggled with in this lesson. All right, well, I will leave that with you unless Julia's got a thought.
Maybe this is a stupid thought. So would a slave be allowed to be an elder?
I don't know. There's not any of these instructions that would preclude it.
Because it sounds to me like it's saying, do what you need to do that's right in your position
Right.
for all of them.
And so we can talk about slavery. The New Testament, I don't think is in favor of slavery, but it gives instructions for how you behave as a slave, which is another whole discussion.
But I would hate to say that the New Testament isn't in favor of women, but it still gives them instructions.
Right.
I don't think it does that either.
No, I don't think it does that either.
Okay.
But there are instructions for, and not here in Titus, in these verses in Titus and Timothy, but in Ephesians and Colossians, there's lists of fathers and children and wives and slaves and masters. There's no instructions here on masters. So there may not have been any masters who were part of the church in Crete. There was only slaves. So you see that there are these household codes, as it's called, where it goes through and kind of tells you how you behave. It's not advocating slavery, but tells you how to behave as a slave. It's not advocating being a woman, but it tells you how to behave as a woman. Okay. We got a thought, Bill?
Yeah, Tim, I know this is a tough topic, and I just want to tell you how much I appreciate all the time and effort you put in to prepare this and try to put it in a way that we can understand it. So I just want to tell you, thank you.
All right, thanks. All right, it's time to stop. Turn us off, Robert.